afternoon, everyone. My name is John Snider. I'm the cotton physiologist here at the University of Georgia. And I think on the program I'm scheduled to talk about stress tolerance in cotton. I'm going to talk about several different things today really that are associated with the cotton physiology program located here in Tifton. What I'd like to do is talk about probably one of the most, I think one of the most commonly occurring stresses, except maybe over this past season. I know sometimes we have wet years, but somewhere in the state of Georgia, the cotton crop is going to be exposed to, if nothing else, short periods of drought stress during the growing season. And in particular, if that drought stress occurs during flowering, it can have a really pronounced effect on yield. So my efforts over the past few years have really been aimed at looking at ways that we can improve our water use efficiency. So we know drought negatively impacts yield in cotton, but we also know that if we apply excessive amounts of water, there's a lot of discussions about competition for water resources. There's environmental concerns, but of probably more immediate importance to our producers, there's also the economic concerns. If water is being applied when it doesn't need to be applied, there's an energy cost associated with it. So that when you're applying water that doesn't need to be applied, that decreases those net returns. And we'll discuss some of that here in a minute. So the other thing, and the reason for that as well, is you can actually reduce yield by applying an excessive amount of irrigation on cotton. So cotton, in its native habitat, or in its sort of native environment, it's a perennial plant. It tends to grow really tall if it's given the resources, and you're pretty well familiar with that. Water, nitrogen, whatever we're talking about here. And under excessive irrigation, the plant will actually grow so large that it will shade some of those lower bolls, and it'll shed some of the lower bolls. So what does that do? It does a couple of things. If you got I think maturity is something you got to think about there. If you've got a really tall plant that's shedding bolls lower on the plant, then it's going to set most of that crop higher up. It's going to delay maturity. But the other thing is you can negatively impact yields by applying too much water with cotton. So we need to be looking at ways to efficiently schedule irrigation. Some more traditional approaches are aimed at kind of defining crop evapotranspiration. And when we talk about that, that's transpiration, that's water loss from the leaves, plus evaporation from the soil. Now it's estimated in most of these irrigation scheduling apps, or which you'll hear about, or you may not hear about today. That may be going on at the same time as my talk is, but most of this is scheduled using reference ET. Let me find my mouse here. There we go. Reference ET, which is calculated using weather station data. All right. So as long as you have access to a weather station, evapotranspiration, reference evapotranspiration is calculated for you. So that's fairly simple. But then we can get at crop evapotranspiration. Keep losing the mouse for some reason here, and that clicker's not working over there. So crop evapotranspiration, we can get at that by using that reference evapotranspiration and multiplying it by this thing we call the crop coefficient. The crop coefficient, that's crop specific and growth stage specific. All right? So just as an example, if evapotranspiration for a certain period of time was an inch, and the crop coefficient at that particular period of development is 1.2, you'd apply 1.2 inches of water, right? That would be the crop evapotranspiration. Now, that tells us about water use. The other side of this is that we have to know how much water is available in that soil profile before it's depleted, and then we have to replenish that. So we have to know something about the effective rooting depth, and in most situations that's estimated, soil water holding capacity, and that sort of thing. There's other ways to estimate crop water use. So there's these checkbook methods where we just say, okay, during this particular week of development, cotton needs this much water. So we subtract rainfall and supply the balance with irrigation. Okay, so a very simple approach to irrigation, and historically has produced maximum yields. And of course, if you've ever been to any of George Belita's talks, he'll talk a lot about soil moisture sensors, and there's a lot of people interested in using soil moisture sensors for scheduling irrigation. So from my perspective as a physiologist, one of the best sensors we can use to tell whether the crop needs to be irrigated is the crop itself. So yeah, atmospheric factors determine, hold on here, boy, I keep losing that mouse. Atmospheric factors determine crop water use, and then of course soil characteristics. But what are some other things that affect crop water use? If we were to look at that crop coefficient, the crop coefficient tracks leaf area development during the season. So the larger canopy we have, the more water that crop overall is going to use. Okay, effective rooting depth. The larger the root system, or the deeper the root system, the larger that reservoir, right? That soil water reservoir. So that affects how often a person is going to need to irrigate. So not only do we have environmental factors affecting the need to irrigate, we also have the plant itself that's impacting how often we need to irrigate. It's affecting crop water use. So all of these things come into play. And so the water status of the crop itself is probably the best indication of the need to irrigate. So I had a study in which we used pre-dawn measures of water potential. That's basically when the plant is fully hydrated. That's the highest the water potential is going to be for the entire day. We had a study where we imposed different irrigation treatments. We had a dry land, and then we had a checkbook treatment, and we also had the checkbook being the University of Georgia recommendation, and then 3 plant-based triggers, which I'll get into here in a minute. And so this was 2014. You can see that drought stress had a pronounced effect on canopy development. So this would be a crop on this side of the line. This is a transition zone where the variable rate pivot switched from dry land to that checkbook approach. And you can see a few things here. You can see that this crop is cutting out early, so we're nearly at cutout. We don't have canopy closure, whereas this one we weren't at cutout yet, and we had full canopy closure, as you would expect for normal crop development. So this study was conducted at Stripling Irrigation Research Park. We had a couple of different cultivars. There were no significant effects there, so I'm not going to talk about cultivars right now. And we have those 5 different irrigation treatments that I mentioned previously. So I want you to notice in those red boxes there in 2013, so just as a general rule, give or take, we say that cotton needs about 46 centimeters of water during a normal growing season in Georgia. All right? So 2013, we had substantially more than that during the growing season, had quite a bit of rainfall. 2014, we were at a deficit year. That was a year that we saw that drought stress, right? So this is the water potential data, and you can see in 2013 there, you can see in 2013, we only crossed this threshold a few times during the season, whereas in 2014, you can see some of these treatments, especially you see the dry land there, you can see that water potential threshold, even the lowest one was crossed. So we had some severe drought stress during that growing season. If we look at it as an average for each plot and calculate our mean and standard error for pre-dawn water potential, there's no difference in 2013. In 2014, you can see there's this stair-step decline in pre-dawn water potential for each treatment. 2013, no difference in lint yield, not surprising. 2014, so we got our dry year. Checkbook yielded the same as this, we'll call these, so just for the sake of keeping things simple, this would be treatment 1, and then all the way down here would be treatment 5 in order of increasing stress, okay? So treatment 1, you can see, yeah, we matched the highest yields, okay? Our plant-based trigger, let's see, our plant-based trigger here had the highest yields, and then as we moved on to treatment 3, 4, and 5 here, you can see that drop in yield. But the important thing to look at here is if we look at water use efficiency, because the amount of water applied was different from one year to the next, you can see that our checkbook approach, or what I keep doing here, our checkbook approach was the least water use efficient in 2013, and you can see that all of these ones, you say, well, they're pretty water use efficient, so dry land, I mean, we might as well not irrigate cotton, you could say. Well, in a dry year, you can see that we got some pretty big differences in water use efficiency. So our checkbook, again, was not as water use efficient. In this situation, it was significantly lower than treatment 2. So treatment 2 did a couple of things for us. Maximized our yields and gave us the highest water use efficiency as well. All right, fiber quality. I'm not going to say much about fiber quality in 2013 because there was no difference in fiber quality for 2013 between all these treatments. 2014 there was. So you can see some differences here. Again, I don't want to dwell on all of these, but I did want to point out the micronair differences here. So under drought stress, so these are our highest yielding treatments. They had an acceptable level of micronair, and if you look at particularly these last two that only received one only received a couple irrigations during the season, the other one didn't get any supplemental irrigation, you can see that micronair was above 5 in those situations. All right, if we look at the average pre-dawn water potential, what it looks like is a 5-bar trigger gave us our highest yield there. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about, so we know that treatment was the most water use efficient. We know that we also know that it gave us the highest yields. So what about net returns? And so I worked with Don Shirley on this, and first thing he did, because most of his numbers are calculated based on pivot irrigation, he just converted the amount of water applied to what would have been applied using an overhead system just based on the efficiencies. And if we look here, we look at our yield, you look at the price. So the highest price we got was in, again, treatment 2. That's adjusted for fiber quality. All right? Net returns, here's what I want to point out here. In terms of net returns, so none of these treatments were different. Treatment 2 was not significantly different from any of the other treatments. Net returns, it cost a grower, it would have cost a grower money to irrigate based on the checkbook approach that year compared to what we did, okay? So it was not our highest net return. If we look in 2014, it was a dry year, hot, dry. In that situation, we produced, I don't know what I'm doing. That mouse keeps disappearing on me. So net returns were the same for both treatment 1 and treatment 2. This was numerically our highest. Now I couldn't get that to work. Is it working there?
You turn it on.
What?
An on switch.
Is there an on switch?
Yeah.
I still don't see it. Anyway.
All right. Click now.
All right. So anyway, so these are our highest net returns here. Numerically, the highest was treatment 2. So what I want to point out in both years is we got the highest net returns in treatment 2 in both years. All right. Checkbook. We got significantly lower net returns this year, but the highest that year. So what's the point I'm wanting to make? Using that approach, we could consistently get the highest net returns using the plant-based trigger. So there is an opportunity to improve our efficiency and increase net returns. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on discussing how the pressure chamber works. I did that this morning. I don't know that it was necessary. There's a good depiction online. They use a great plant, but that's okay. Essentially, during those pre-dawn hours, you go out and you cut the petiole, and that water column that's in the plant is under a certain amount of tension. So when you cut that petiole, the water column snaps back into the column based on how much tension there is, okay? And so then you seal that petiole into the pressure chamber and you pressurize it, and it brings the water column up to the cut surface. The moment that happens, that's when you record the pressure. That is the water potential at that point. It's real simple. Anybody in here can be taught to do it. It sounds real subjective, but if you get to where you're doing this, it could be taught to anyone in here, and it's fairly, like I say, it's fairly straightforward. All right, so what are some of the pros and cons? So this is a reasonably quick measure of water potential. It's very accurate. Problem, it's manual readings and it's pre-dawn, so not everybody wants to be out there pre-dawn, right? So the bigger issue is not just that it's inconvenient. I mean, if it made enough money, I guess you could hire people to go out and do this, but the issue is when you're having to manage several fields, and you may have 160-acre fields, you can't do that with it, the scale is just too big to do it using this approach. All right, you've got a small field. I was managing some drip irrigated plots. It worked fine for a relatively small field. But anyway, so what we did is looked at using canopy temperature sensors. So whenever the plant is drought stressed, the stone will close, transpiration declines, and that canopy temperature increases. And so what we did is we outfitted every one of these plots with an infrared canopy temperature sensor. And I don't want you to get too hung up on this, but what I want to point out is there's a very for a well-watered crop, there's a very predictable relationship between vapor pressure deficit and leaf to air temperature difference, or canopy to air temperature difference. Okay? Very predictable relationship. If we're on this line, we're at drought stress equals a 0, crop water stress index of 0. If we're up here at one of these lines, we're a completely stressed crop. So somewhere in between here is where you want to shoot for in terms of trying to maximize that water use efficiency. If we look at crop water stress index 2013, there's some variability here, but what I want to point out here is that everything kind of hovers around that 0 line. That's where we got all of our rainfall that year. All right. If we look at 2014, you can just see this stair-step increase in crop water stress index. All right. So somewhere in this neighborhood is where we need to be aiming for irrigation scheduling in cotton. So I think there's opportunities there to use both a plant-based approach and use remote sensing. Primed acclimation, I don't know how many of you have heard the term primed acclimation. Some people tell you stress the plant early in the season, get those roots to grow deeper, and then you irrigate it, kind of fully irrigate it later on. That's one of these ideas that I know has been proposed, and I just want to point out, I wouldn't use the term stress, because to me stress implies some sort of negative impact on the crop. You can decrease water to the point that you negatively impact root growth. So you're trying to get those roots to grow deeper, but if you truly stress that plant, you can prevent root growth. So what we're looking at, I don't know if I want to say primed acclimation, but what we're looking at is altering Creton water potential thresholds. This is using soil moisture sensors. Alter those thresholds. All right, so let's just say this would be our wettest treatment, this would be our driest treatment here, okay? Creton. And then after, not Creton, pre-bloom, and then after flowering, everything receives irrigation according to this threshold. All right? Treatment 5 here we had was a rain-fed treatment the entire season. This is just a depiction. You can these sensors. My graduate student worked with George Validas, and yes, this is a nice little depiction of these sensors in the field for each one of these plots. From treatment 1 to treatment 4, there's about 1.2 inches of water saved. No significant, you look at that and you think, well, there's got to be a difference there, but there's no significant difference in yield between treatment 1 and treatment 4, and we say 1.2 inches of water during the early season when water use really isn't that great anyway. All right, so I think there's promise there in terms of maybe using soil moisture sensors and having different thresholds based on the stage of crop development. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about a study I did with Glenn Harris. It's a nitrogen rate study. He's been getting questions about, for example, we got the 3-bale yield recommendation. He gets a lot of questions related to 4-bale yields. And so one of the things we did is come back and kind of revisit this nitrogen question here, and had a whole range of nitrogen rates, and you can see it was split applied, ranged from 0 to 150 pounds per acre. So what did we see? Main thing that really stands out is that 0 treatment. You can see that plant height was much lower. You can see the number of main stem nodes was lower, and nodes above white flower. If you look here, our highest in rate, kind of delayed cutout. If you look there, kind of delayed cutout. Our lowest went into flowering. This is the first week of flowering. We went into flowering almost at cutout then. Cutout's about 3. So somewhere in here, cutout happened. So very early in the season. So that shows you the impact of nitrogen stress. There's a whole bunch of other different parameters that I measured during the season. This is photosynthesis here, photosynthetic electron transport, chlorophyll content. If you look near the end of the season, you just generally see a positive response. So photosynthesis, you can see there's a positive response all the way out to our highest nitrogen treatment. Chlorophyll content, same thing. Now, when we go over here and look at yields, though, we don't get that same response here. So the only one that really stands out is we have our low N, or well, 0 N treatment that was lower than everything else. So we're going to repeat this again this coming year and see how that goes. The other thing, I'll just cover this real quick and then let Jared get up here and talk, is heat tolerance. So we've kind of been working on methods to rapidly screen cultivars out in the field for heat tolerance. So we use chlorophyll fluorescence. This parameter right here, don't worry about the terminology. This is just a measure of photosystem 2 efficiency. And then we just use this rapid heating and cooling element. And we have leaf discs that we've sampled from leaves that were collected in the field. And we alter the temperature that those segments are exposed to. And you can see a nice temperature response curve here for an individual leaf. The temperature causing a 15% decline in efficiency from the maximum is just what we apply across the board in all our heat tolerance work, just so we can have that same number to look at. So T15 is just what we refer to it as. That's our measure of heat tolerance. So in this situation, the temperature causing that 15% decline is 43.4 degrees. The higher that number, the more heat tolerant that leaf is. All right. This is our different environments. So heat tolerance is affected by environmental conditions. So that means location, irrigation, sample date, all of those things can have an effect. So if you'll look, we had 18 different, I'd call it heat tolerance environments if we want to refer to it like that. And then these are all these T15 values, average T15 values throughout the season. Every now and then we'd see a cultivar difference. We'd see one that stood out from the rest of them. I'm not going to focus on that so much, but you can see that environment played a pretty strong role, meaning that this is an acclimation response to temperature. So do some of these varieties acclimate better to high temperatures or drought stress? Maybe. But this is something that we're going to definitely explore a little further in the future, because we have water potential data, we have temperature data, all kinds of information for these sites as well.